Welcome to Inclusionism. It is 5:34 and 57 seconds, 58:59, 5:35 p.m. I'm your host, James Felton Keith. Welcome to Harlem, to Inclusionism, where we like to say individuals are at their best when they identify with the community, and communities are only at their best when they identify all of their individuals. This is a nerdy show, and we're going to get, pretty nerdy and political today. I guess this is also a political show. Today we have Benjamin Hett. Am I pronouncing that right?
Hett, actually.
Hett. Benjamin Hett. Apologies, H-E-T-T. He is a historian and on faculty down at Hunter. My husband went to Hunter. You're still at Hunter, right?
I'm still at Hunter and at the CUNY Graduate Center, too.
Okay, right. All right. Just want to make sure I had that part right. And
I need to name all my institutions.
And there's so many. I have a long bio here, folks. We're going to put it on the website so you can, read his mother's maiden name and his social security number and everything right there. And we'll have it all there for you. But what's provoked this conversation today is he recently last year wrote The Death of Democracy, Hitler's Rise to Power, and the Downfall of the Weimar Republic. If any of you are not familiar, this is the governmental institution that came about after World War I. And the book just came out on paperback a couple months ago this summer. And so before we tumble down that rabbit hole, first, Benjamin, thanks for joining us.
It's a real pleasure, James. Happy to be here.
Yeah, and and it's a rainy day outside, and you came all the way from Queens down here to Harlem today. So yeah, I know that trek is not easy. It's almost like flying to another state.
Pretty much, not least with all the weekend stuff the MTA does to us.
Yeah, we can do a lot better with regards to the MTA. So I guess, how much of this book, before we get into some of the details and the interesting characters in this book, what does this book say about who you are as a person, or your peak interest? Like, what brought you here right now?
That's an interesting question. Okay, so I think there are maybe two answers to that.
Okay, all right.
So I started writing that book, it may not surprise you too much, shortly after the 2016 election.
Okay.
But
that's a fast write.
Prior to that, I had spent about the previous 15 years doing little other than research and write about this particular chapter of history, the downfall of the Weimar Republic. I did two previous books on that.
Yeah.
So I must have some sort of fixation, I think, on the way democracy failed in Germany in the 20s and 30s and what that means for us. And I think the 2016 election, in some mysterious way, crystallized that fear for me.
Yeah, well, the crystallization of that fear, I think it hit a lot of us. I think the week after his election, I had a conference in Denver for a group that I used to be on the board of called OSTEM. These are the LGBT people in STEM fields. And I'm an engineer, but these were mostly not engineers. These were, career academics, people getting PhDs in scientific fields. And this particular conference, I was going to speak about data and identity, but people were at this conference, and there were like grief rooms and suicide watch volunteers that were at this conference. I mean, it's a relatively big conference. Big companies are there recruiting, Raytheon and Northrop Grumman, governmental agency partners were there. And even as I, am a bit of a political animal, I think started to get over the initial shock that Trump won. I realized that the rest of the world wasn't going to bounce back like that. Maybe I hadn't even bounced back like that, but
I'm waiting to bounce back.
You're still waiting, but yeah. I think I'm still there in shock too. I just think I've, professionally, and this is a horrible thing to say, but I guess I'm just going to say it. I think I've become pretty good at sort of denying my real emotions and just trucking on,
Well, that's probably a necessary survival skill in this era.
It's one of those like bad man things. Like I think something was wrong with my shoulder the other day, and I didn't schedule a doctor's appointment till I think I'll make it there next week. I'm treating it like it's not a big deal, but it may be a big deal. Way too much TMI. So All right, so this book does say, I guess, quite a bit about your research in general, but also what Trump is, compelling us to consider in general. But what about before that? So you were interested in democracies in general, the histories of democracies in general, or just this particular democracy? It's a pretty interesting.
It is.
I think of all the places over
Actually,
the course of the
probably
past 300
both.
years. Yeah.
Probably, you know what? As we're having this conversation, it just
Sure.
occurred to me that if we're going to go back a little bit,
Sure. Go. Yeah.
when I was about 3 years old, according to my mother,
That's good.
and my
yeah.
dad would sort of tell me what to do, I would stand and stare at his kneecap and tell him I wasn't going to do it. And I think there was a certain, maybe a little bit of, I was kind of born someone who didn't necessarily want to do what somebody told me to
Yeah.
do, and I think maybe that transfers into my political outlook. So I think maybe I have had a kind of lifelong fixation with democracy. But then there's something about Germany
Yeah.
in the 20s and 30s. I think, it's the paradox. I kind of start the book
Yeah.
talking about this. Germany in the 20s really marks one of the civilizational high points of humankind. If you think about
Yeah.
things happening in the arts, there were any number of brilliant musicians and visual artists active there. There were any number of incredible scientists. I mean, Einstein was working there at the time, and there were all kinds of geniuses. Germany was leading the world in physics. It was leading the world in engineering and philosophy.
Well.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there's basically almost nothing in which
Yeah.
the Germans weren't really running with the ball in the 1920s. And
Sure.
I think we sort of assume that barbarism can't come out of high civilization, that those must be things on two different planes. And
Sure.
yet it did. That's exactly what did happen.
Sure.
And there's something about that. I think it's an urgent thing for us to understand as human beings and as citizens of a democracy. We need to know, how could this actually happen? How can you go from a country which not only has all this great cultural stuff going on,
Sure.
it has probably the world's most progressive political constitution at the time. It's the most really democratically designed state.
Yeah.
And yet out of all of that, you get to Hitler, you get to the Holocaust, you get to barbarism in
Sure.
1,000 different ways. And I think I've thought for many years that it's important to try to understand that.
Sure. I mean, yeah, I think, well, I don't even know where to start. But yeah, when I think about, Germany and its, relative, prolific state, I mean, considering its neighbors, I mean, there's some interesting stuff coming out of France, and the UK is a little bit far away. But yeah, I think from Charlemagne onward, there were some interesting things happening there. Some good, some bad. Wars happened, etc. I'm not some people are gonna watch this and be like, why are you giving so much credit to the Germans? But no, I mean, they had some real identifiable wins. I think a lot of the I grew up going to school. I was a philosophy wonk before I thought I would go to engineering school because it was a way to get a job. And then I thought, I could do this because it's logical.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of the argumentation and discourses and, moral and, the ethics, philosophy that we were considering were mostly things coming out of Germany, and things coming out of the 19th and early 20th century. And so, sure, they were right up there. The cool cars,
Oh, absolutely.
I think, Porsche 911 is like the only car, and then you have other cars.
It was around later, but they had Mercedes that were pretty happening, and BMW.
I'm saying they've been doing stuff.
Yeah.
I'm still I'm a Beamer fan, but I used to drive a Z4 forever, and it was like my baby. It was a two-seater. It was a quarter-life crisis. I wasn't quite old enough to but at 30, I was definitely having a quarter-life crisis. I was like, I need a small car with two seats with, more than 300 horses to make me feel like Bond driving through Germany in a movie.
Right.
But anyway, that said, I think obviously the obvious, trigger for this particular conversation is that I think a lot of America is thinking it's impossible for us to tumble out of the relatively robust democracy that we've had for the past, few centuries. And it's not, it's all at risk.
It's not.
And so per the characters, the leaders that you've identified in this text, I was going to ask you, do you think it was a failure of leadership or institutions or either of those responses to culture? But it's probably too broad of a question. I think I want to fall back a bit and just talk about, two interesting political parties that formed a coalition, but mainly what were the Social Democrats in Germany in 1918, 1920? What was their role, and does it translate over into any of the political factions that we see today? If so, which ones? Like, who are the Social Democrats here now?
So that's a more complicated question than it probably should be.
Sure. Yeah.
So the Social Democratic Party, back before World War I, had been the party ostensibly committed to the ideas of Karl Marx, so ostensibly there in favor of revolution and basically, expropriating capitalists and taking over. Now, the thing is, since the 1890s, they had in practice become much more moderate. They had in practice become a party of parliamentary reform. They represent basically urban working class people, generally unionized workers. That's who their base is. They've become a parliamentary reform party. And then there's a further evolution when World War I ends and the Social Democrats, there's regime change in Germany, the monarchy goes, the Social Democrats basically take over the reins of the state. And it's the Social Democrats who basically reformulate Germany into a parliamentary democracy because they make the conscious choice that they want to be what we would call today democratic socialists, not revolutionary Marxists. And so they are the ones who draft the Constitution. What they stand for then is a parliamentary democracy, basically a liberal democracy, but with a sort of emphasis on making conditions better for working people. So they institute a lot of social programs, a state-run wage arbitration system. They basically build rights of worker representation into the worker representation in factories into the Constitution. Yeah. So in today's terms, you might compare them. They'd be roughly where the kind of left wing of the Democratic Party is in terms of what they're actually for and about. Sure.
So the Social Democrats, Germany, 1920, similar to the Democratic Socialists here. Yep. I mean, and they are, I've been to a few Democratic Socialist meetings on the Upper West Side here in Manhattan, and there are a few, there are a few people, I was going to say that remind me of like communist rallies, but clearly I'm not old enough to have been in any communist rallies back in the 1920s. But it's just what you think. There's an older man there with an accent that sounds, east of Eastern Europe, somewhere east. East can possibly be.
In the 1920s, that would have been a young man, but otherwise
right.
Good.
He was probably there in the 1920s. He probably came around in the 1930s and is still here and is lecturing people. Literally, I'm thinking about a person, I'm thinking specifically about an apartment that, and a party that I attended. And I was listening to, some of these folks' ideas, and I just thought, it's interesting that these are now the ideas of, these are people in the Democratic Party. And as I'm a member of the Democratic Party here in Manhattan, and I just thought, this is totally different language than I've ever heard in my lifetime. And I've only been here, I haven't quite been here for decades yet. And I was a bit flabbergasted